Recently, the Ukrainian government came up with a bright idea to rename an avenue in Kiev after the name of Stepan Bandera, and they did so right on the eve of a date which reminds the Polish people of some tragic events and which is a stumbling block in the Ukrainian-Polish relations. Today, the Ukrainian government had another bright idea, to pretend that they were honoring the memory of the Volhynian massacre victims. Whether this bowing of the heads will help, I do not know. I'm no longer certain. Our interviewee today is Tadeusz Isakowicz-Zaleski. For many, the name of this activist, writer and publicist speaks for itself. This is the opinion of Poland, who does not accept certain Ukrainian heroes. I was born in Krakow, but my parents, who are no longer alive, are from Kresy Wschodnie, which means Eastern Borderlands. My father is from the village Monastyrskoye, near Buchach in Ternopil land. My mother came from an Armenian family from Ivano-Frankivsk. My father survived hundreds of attacks by the Ukrainian insurgent army on the village where my grandparents lived. This was in the village of Krynytsia. My father was an eyewitness and began collecting evidence of those crimes. When I was little, my father told me about it and I thought it was all very interesting. Later on, after university, I began collecting the evidence myself. I traveled to Ukraine because I have family there. This is how I know that Ukrainians do not know the truth about the massacres of Poles in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia, and so I decided to write a few books. The first book sold out very quickly. The book has been republished several times. After that, I decided to write more books to show, including to younger generations of Poles, what the Volhynian slaughter or the genocide by the Ukrainian insurgent army was like. Today, you have an opportunity to speak to Ukrainians and explain what the Volhynian slaughter was like. Why do things like this happen, and how did this happen? First of all, I would like to say that it is wrong to believe that it was the Ukrainian people killing the Polish people. These conflicts were different. My great-grandfather was a Ukrainian, a Greek Catholic priest, and considered himself a Carpatho-Russian. He had a great number of very good Polish friends. My grandmother went to church. My father also loved going to church, even when he lived in Krakow. Despite some minor differences, the Polish-Ukrainian relations before the Second World War were quite good. Unfortunately, Ukrainian nationalism, Stepan Bandera's movement, and then the Ukrainian insurgent army, led by Roman Shukhevych, began to adopt slogans such as Ukraine for Ukrainians only, and the belief that all chuzhinci or aliens, meaning people who are not Ukrainians, should be expelled from Ukraine or eliminated physically. The genocide started with Jews, then spread to Poles, because Poles at the time were a large minority in those lands. Moreover, Volhynian Czechs, my Armenian ancestors in Kuti on the Cheremosh River, were also subjected to the genocide, as well as Gypsies and other minorities. The Bandera partisans also killed Ukrainians who did not support Bandera's movement, and also killed those Ukrainians who saved Poles. I must say that there were some decent Ukrainians who not only did not take part in the killings, but also helped Poles, and I depict such people in my books. What caused the Ukrainian insurgent army and Shukhevych to start the genocide in 1943? Here, I would like to add that Bandera and Shukhevych both lived in Poland at the time, because no Ukrainian state had existed yet. Bandera and Shukhevych were engaged in terrorist activities against the Polish state, killing officials, members of parliament, and representatives of Polish authorities. But these were not mass crimes. These were isolated attacks of a political nature. In 1939, when Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, Bandera and Shukhevych went to Krakow, my hometown, where, under Nazis' protection, they began to form a Ukrainian arm sponsored by Germans. They adopted the German National Socialism ideology and believed that they could kill people of other nationalities. The killings began in 1939 and continued in 1941 when the Ukrainian insurgent army was created. It was then when they came up with the idea that all Poles must be exterminated, and they started with the Volhynia region. This was in 1942. Why? Because Hitler had lost at Stalingrad, and it was clear that the Red Army would sooner or later come to the former Polish territory. Once all Jews were exterminated, they decided it was time to get rid of the Poles. Essentially, the extermination began in the February of 1943. It was primarily aimed at Polish villages, and people were killed in rural areas mostly, not officers or functionaries. Those were ordinary farmers who had lived there for centuries. In Volhynia, about 60,000 Poles were killed in 1943. Between 1944 and 1947, about 100,000 were killed in other regions, such as Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Lviv region, near the Polish region of Rzeszów. part of Lubicy and Polesia regions. It must be emphasized that it was not a war. It was not a military engagement. It was an attack on defenseless people. The major date for those events is the Bloody Sunday on the 11th of July 1943, when hundreds of Ukrainian insurgents supported by the so-called toporniki, axemen, Ukrainian farmers armed with axes and pitchforks, attacked 100 settlements at the same time in one day. The Ukrainian insurgent army had planned the attack on Sunday because they knew that Poles would go to church. The Ukrainian insurgents attacked the churches and massacred people during the Mass barbarously. They came in the worship service time and hacked people with axes. Some priests, for example, priest Karol Baran, were sawn in half. Those were horrible things. Germans were cruel. Russians too were cruel. But one can't imagine the kind of things the Ukrainian nationalists and Bandera partisans did. But telling the truth about the matter does not mean being against the Ukrainian people. Quite the opposite. Our banners say Poland, Ukraine, friendship and cooperation. However, the only thing that the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and the SS Division Galicia deserve is disgrace and damnation. We have another slogan that says, victims do not want revenge, they want to be remembered. We don't want to change our borders. We're not talking about annexing those lands back to Poland or that Ukrainians should leave Poland. On the contrary, we want to cooperate. Ukrainians are a Christian nation and Slavic people. But we do not agree to this cult of criminals from the Ukrainian insurgent army being the dominant cult in Ukraine. However, this is exactly what the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, is making by glorifying the criminals. I believe that these are the elements of the Polish-Ukrainian relations which need to be changed. I hear increasingly often that it was probably people from the law enforcement agency of the Soviet Union, called NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, dressed in UPA uniforms, who executed the Volhynian slaughter. Do you think such a scenario could be possible? No, such scenario was not possible. Of course, there might have been isolated cases, but this operation was carried out by Bandera's movement single-handedly. Stepan Bandera murdered Polish ministers and officials in the 1930s and was therefore sentenced to death. But the Polish government changed the sentence to life imprisonment and later even released him from prison. Most UPA's crimes in Volhynia have been well documented and researched. Initially, the crimes were committed by the OUN. They were the armed wings of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They were called Banderovci, after the name of Stepan Bandera. Since late 1942, the crimes were committed by the UPA. We have accounts of the massacre and some witnesses who are still alive and who described it. Also, some UPA members were taken prisoner, either by Poles or Russians, after the war, and both sides confirmed the crime. It was not a movement against Germans. On the contrary, they supported the Germans. The Germans supported the UPA. As a result, the UPA acted overtly. They believed that Ukraine would become a state under Germany's protection and leadership, an independent Ukraine. They believed they were doing it all for the new Ukrainian state. Some Ukrainians say that you had the Home Army and we had the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and that they're the same. No, they're not. They're not the same. The Home Army and partisans in other countries, there was a resistance movement in France and similar movements in other countries. They did not commit genocide. Of course, there were crimes. One cannot say they never did anything wrong. That did have a place, but those were isolated cases. The leaders of the Home Army even punished by death anyone who killed women or children, while the UPA's activity was aimed at exterminating people. All accounts reflect the same pattern. Hundreds of UPA members would surround a village at night when people were going to bed and would attack the defenseless village, where there were no soldiers, no guerrillas. The first group killed everyone, women, children, old people, etc. The second group looted, and the third group burnt the village. We see the same pattern everywhere. Where that happened, there's not even a trace of those villages today. Where my father lived, there's nothing there, not a single village. I believe those were conscious and planned acts that pursued extermination. It was not a war with armed forces on one side fighting against other armed forces on the other side. Later on, of course, there was the Home Army that defended such villages. They were on the defensive. Petro Poroshenko said, "We forgive and ask for forgiveness." These are absolutely false words, because he, just like his predecessor Viktor Yushchenko, glorifies criminals. Does it look like a reconciliation if they believe slaughtering Poles and Jews was a good thing, these murderers now being national heroes and monuments being built to them? Something like this would not have contributed to Poland's relations with Germany. 70 years ago, the Germans manifestly distanced themselves from National Socialism. There are no monuments to Hitler or Himmler in Germany today. The Germans are not saying that the SS or the Gestapo are heroes, but these things are similar to what Ukraine is doing. I will even say more. Petro Poroshenko and Viktor Yushchenko want to say that the Volhynian slaughter was merely a conflict between Ukrainians and Poles, and the former were just killing the latter, and it would be better to honor the memory of the victims on both sides. But they cannot say that because the genocide was perpetrated by the Ukrainian side. They cannot just mix it all up. They should tell it like it was. One side was the slaughtermen and the other were the victims. Of course, there were bad things done by Poles, and this is something that needs to be talked about. Wouldn't it be better to just forget about the Volyn massacre for the sake of friendship between Poland and Ukraine against Russia? There are people who think so. Sure, but there was no Russian aggression 10 years ago. When I was on the Maidan in Kiev during the Orange Revolution, it was the year 2004. There was a lot of enthusiasm. Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko sang the song Razom nas bohato, United we're many. What happened? Yushchenko was trying to put hands around Tymoshenko's throat, and Tymoshenko put her energy into her business. As a matter of fact, Viktor Yushchenko had a great chance to build very good relations between Poland and Ukraine. But he decided to glorify the criminals instead, which led to an ongoing conflict between the families of the victims and Ukraine. I don't think there's a situation where you can make it a good situation by becoming oblivious of something about it. They say no one has yet reached reconciliation based on lies and silence. Unfortunately, what we see today is lies from the present Ukrainian government and silence on the part of Poland's ruling party, Law and Justice. Sadly, the two negative foundations exist, and I think that this issue will keep coming back to us. First, they must tell the truth that yes, the genocide did take place. We need to honor the victims and bury them because they have no graves. They should not build monuments to the UPA. This is essential for reconciliation. Why are the people who insist on the truth about the Volyn massacre called Putin's agents? This is an absolutely primitive definition. It's the same as when someone criticizing the Ukrainian insurgent army in Poland and Ukraine automatically becomes Putin's agent. Unfortunately, this is what happens when someone cannot support their views and when a topic is not discussed. The easiest thing is to say that you're an agent of the Kremlin. This is primitive and absurd. I think Polish society does not want to continue hearing these lies. Polish society is waiting for the truth to be told. We do not want bad relations with Ukraine. On the contrary, I have family there in Ukraine. I believe that we must have good relations. However, they must be based on the truth.